The 20th century was a time of incredible change. Unspeakable horrors and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century where we showed what we are truly capable of. The pure imagination of artistic expression. The insidious desire to harm and oppress. The will to fight against the weight of a prevailing status quo. The drive to understand the universe and to improve our lives. A century made by leaders and revolutionaries, scientists and thinkers, artists,
wait till you see Muhammad.
icons, heroes, and villains. We will count down through the 101 figures of the 20th century who have shaped the world in which we live, and whose stories form the tapestry of our history. On this episode,
I think it was a big loss for Afghanistan. Clearly had been assassinated as a gift for the Taliban.
I think Gates's greatest achievement was his role in democratizing computing.
Hitchcock created a form of filmmaking which I think remains what many filmmakers today really aspire to.
she saw the simple, easy elegance of men's clothes and wanted women to have it too. Through 2 world wars, she created some of the most iconic fashions of the century. (1913). Women were wearing corsets and fussy, detailed dresses when Coco Chanel began designing clothes. Her goal was simple: to give women the opportunity to be comfortable and look modern. One of her earliest creations was a dress she had fashioned out of a men's jersey sweatshirt. Her designs were comfortable and entirely practical, attracting the attention of women eager to escape their corsets.
Her designs seemed very modern. That real idea of ready-to-wear, so taking it away from couture and ball gowns, she introduced jersey so that the fabrics had stretch. It looked like women had another life rather than just being a cut-out doll in a big ball gown.
The keynote of these fashions is simplicity of design, as exemplified by this blue woolen costume in which Miss Stevenson appears.
Chanel's business struggled through the economic depression of the 1930s, but it was not until the outbreak of World War II in 1939 that she closed her doors. She wouldn't reopen them until 1954. When Chanel finally returned to Paris, she launched one of her most lasting designs, a woman's suit that has been copied countless times.
Évidemment, c'est ce que j'ai cherché, c'était mon but. Créer un style, il n'y en avait plus. À mon sens, car il n'y a pas de style en France. Il y a un style dans une nation de ça. Il y a un style quand les gens de la rue sont habillés comme vous.
Simple and stylish, the suit was at odds with the other dominant fashion of the time, Dior's new look.
Another veteran, Coco Chanel, shows her traditional love for materials and their texture. Its hemline, a rigid 2 inches below the knee, a gaily colored velvet print suit with matching handbag, has the style which for many women has become almost a classic uniform.
Its simple elegance and comfort won over women around the world, including First Lady Jackie Kennedy. Chanel was also the first designer to launch a perfume in her own name. Chanel No. 5 sold in the same elegant Art Deco bottle for over 90 years. A label made notorious when Marilyn Monroe was asked what she wore to bed, and she audaciously replied, Chanel No. 5. Coco Chanel's designs have endured for one simple reason. Her design priorities were simplicity and comfort. She understood women's needs, and her clothes met them, while remaining elegant and timeless.
Coco Chanel has contributed a look that you know when the minute you see it is Chanel. She created some core icons and emblems within her collections that will last eternally.
Born into privilege and afforded every social and economic opportunity, raised to value pacifism and tolerance, he would cast off material aspirations and dedicate his life to social activism.
Would you be prepared to die in the cause of India's independence?
Mohandas Gandhi began his career as a lawyer working in South Africa in the final years of the 19th century, witnessing firsthand the tyranny of apartheid before it was enshrined into law. On his return to India in 1914, Gandhi began to criticize the heavy-handed approach of British officers. Before long, he was encouraging poor villagers around India to improve their conditions through non-violent protests. As his activism increased, he began to be referred to as Mahatma, or Great Soul, a name that would linger long after his death and that he is most widely recognized by today. With his increasing notoriety came more influence. By 1921, he was leading the Indian National Congress, making independence from British rule a core principle of the party. In the early 1920s, he led a boycott of British products and institutions. For this movement, he ended up serving 2 years in prison. After his release, Gandhi continued to instigate non-violent protests in support of an independent India. Renowned for his use of fasting, images of an emaciated, robed Gandhi on hunger strike became famous around the world.
Regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
It would take years, but Gandhi's influence would eventually be too great for Britain to ignore, finally granting India their independence on the 15th of August 1947. They partitioned colonial India into 2 states, Pakistan, with a Muslim majority, and India, with a Hindu majority.
The national flag was publicly unfurled. For the rest, it was crowd, 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 all rejoicing over the birth of the Dominion of India.
Gandhi may have achieved his goal, but his beliefs, particularly in the idea of peace between religions, did make enemies. 6 attempts were made on his life. Almost all have been attributed to Nathuram Godse, the man who ultimately assassinated Gandhi in 1948.
This was in his residence, Birla House, and it was here that he died after being shot during his prayer meeting nearby.
Mahatma Gandhi's actions inspired movements around the world against colonialism, racism, and violence. 3 of the most important social revolutions of the 20th century. A mathematician who strived to understand the capacity of the human mind, he created a device capable of taking us far beyond our limitations. Alan Turing began studying mathematics at Cambridge University in 1931, quickly turning to the possibility of digital computation.
Turing was part of a group of people in the 30s and 40s that were exploring what thinking is, what calculation is. So they were generally looking at nervous systems, they were looking at feedback in machines, calculating machines in this very kind of open-ended way because it was all new.
In the mid-1930s, Turing was attempting to understand the limitations of a human's ability to compute mathematical problems. He created what he called the Turing machine and proved that it could compute everything the human brain could, marking out the limits of human computation. In 1938, Turing joined the government Code and Cipher School. With the outbreak of World War II, he moved to their wartime headquarters at Bletchley Park.
During the Second World War, he was involved with the sophisticated calculators for cracking the German code on the Enigma machines. He helped develop a very, very sophisticated calculating machine, not a true computer, for cracking that code.
By 1942, Turing's machine was decoding 84,000 messages a month, or 2 messages every minute.
His work cracking the German code shortened the Second World War considerably.
After the war, Turing turned to work as a computer designer. In 1946, he finished designs for a digital computer that could store programs in its memory. This was modern computing. Turing was also an early pioneer of artificial intelligence, or AI.
He came up with a model for AI, which we now know as the Turing test, which is sort of sidestepping the issue of whether a computer would really think like a person, and just saying if it could fool people into thinking that it was a person, then it must be doing a pretty good job of emulating it, and that it's almost irrelevant whether it really is thinking the same way.
Turing's work is now considered to be the basis for modern computer science.
I think a lot of people don't realize how mixed together, cognitive science, neuroscience, mathematics, what we now know as computing, were at the time. And there was a lot of bouncing ideas off each other. And Turing was part of that, and I think that's one of the big kind of intellectual movements, certainly of the 20th century.
The fact that Alan Turing changed the course of the Second World War is enough to make him a significant figure of the century. But he was also an incredible thinker who laid the groundwork for one of the most important technological advancements in human history. He fought for over a decade on the front lines for the freedom of Afghanistan, first against invading forces and then against his own country's government.
If you look at photographs of Massoud, he was a very powerful figure. He was sort of a romantic figure too, sort of Che Guevara of Afghanistan.
General Ahmed Shah Massoud. He has been described as the Afghan who won the Cold War. A charismatic and clever leader, he commanded the Northern Alliance, one group of Afghan resistance fighters known collectively as the Mujahideen, who fought against the Soviet forces that invaded Afghanistan in 1979.
Afghan resistance to the Soviet invasion has been so fierce that the country is now closed to Western newsmen.
From his base of operations in the picturesque Panjshir Valley, north of Kabul, Massoud led an incredibly effective campaign of resistance against repeated Soviet incursions, earning him the nickname the Lion of Panjshir. The Soviets were finally driven out of Afghanistan in 1989.
Now, after 10 bloody years, the Soviets are gone. The question is, what comes next?
The hope was that the Mujahideen would unite to govern the country. Instead, the Taliban took control, capturing the capital, Kabul, and most of the country in 1996.
They claimed to control 90% of the country. The 10% they didn't control was Massoud's. His area was never taken over.
Massoud held the north, leading his fighters for over 10 years of resistance against the Taliban. They were never able to take the Panjshir Valley. Massoud was a well-educated man, a lover of poetry, and an excellent tactician in guerrilla warfare, earning the love and respect of those he led.
He was absolutely adored by his fighters, and I have seen them in tears as they talk about him, with absolute love for him.
Massoud was on the ground in Afghanistan during a tumultuous period, directly resisting insidious forces as they began to gain a foothold. His address to the European Parliament in April 2001 warned of the growing threat that Osama bin Laden posed to the West.
و پیام ما با آقای بوشی است که اگر در قسمت تأمین صلح در افغانستان توجه نشه و مردم افغانستان در راه رسیدن صلح کمک نکنه به یقین که مشکل نه تنها دامنگیر افغانستان بلکه دامنگیر امریکا و تعداد بیشتری از کشورها خواهد شد.
On the 9th of September 2001, 2 Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists detonated explosives inside their video camera, killing Massoud.
I think it was clearly a big loss for Afghanistan. Dying on the eve of 9/11 clearly had been assassinated as a gift for the Taliban, because they knew he was the most powerful figure and the person that most able to do something against them.
Massoud's continuing legacy is complex. Romanticized for his success in leading the Northern Alliance first against the Soviets and then the Taliban, criticized for waging a particularly bloody conflict against those forces. Massoud was at the center of the struggle to free Afghanistan from foreign forces, using his country as their battleground. A struggle he would never truly see resolved, and which eventually cost him his life. A multi-billion-dollar empire with a logo that is recognizable throughout the world, built through one man's vision for global domination. In 1954, Ray Kroc was working as a salesman for the multi-mixer bulk milkshake maker.
He was 50 years old. He had not really done anything extraordinary in his life. But he saw these customers out at this hamburger stand in LA where, most people would buy 1 or 2 milkshake machines, and these guys were buying 6 to 8 at once. And he went to see for himself, who are these people who are doing so much volume that they need so many of these?
What he discovered and what he would help it to become would define fast food worldwide. Brothers Richard and Maurice McDonald operated their restaurant with unparalleled efficiency. The kitchen was clean and the food was fast. They had a short menu, all prepared in an assembly line that was revolutionary at the time. Costs of the business were low, and so were the prices on the menu. Ray Kroc knew he could take this concept to the rest of the country. So he convinced the McDonald brothers to hire him as their franchise manager.
There were 2 main things that were his big contributions to McDonald's becoming a success. One is this notion that the hamburger and the products associated with it, you would have standardization, that you could replicate what happened in a store in Chicago, in a store in New Orleans, in one in Buffalo. The second was that he turned service into a brand.
Under Kroc's control, the company's expansion grew exponentially. By 1965, there were over 700 McDonald's restaurants throughout America. Over the following decades, McDonald's restaurants would open from Colombia to Jerusalem, China to India, adjusting the menu to cater to the needs of each market. By 1996, McDonald's was operating in over 100 countries. From Ray Kroc's vision of expansion came a massive global success story. But McDonald's has also been criticized as a symbol of American economic and cultural chauvinism.
I am home. This is American food. South Africa is home.
You can downplay the importance of McDonald's in the way we eat or as a business, but we shouldn't underestimate its impact. Not only does this brand endure after more than a half a century, it has become an icon, a representative of American culture. You go around the world, you see McDonald's absolutely everywhere. So it created a brand that can travel the world in a way that many others have tried to do since then. It turned food production and service into an industry.
Her study of the animal world would challenge long-held beliefs, leading to a life spent campaigning for the rights of those who could not be heard.
It isn't only humans who know emotions. It isn't only humans capable of mental as well as physical suffering.
With no formal scientific training and no university degree, Jane Goodall embarked on a study of chimpanzees in Tanzania when she was 26 years old. It was 1960. At the time, no one had successfully studied a chimpanzee community. Goodall was determined. and patient.
It was a frustrating time for her. She spent months climbing mountains trying to get close to the chimpanzees, and it took her about 4 or 5 months to even get them warm up.
After months of effort, Goodall finally had the chimpanzees relaxed enough in her presence that she could observe their behavior. Her approach was not that of a conventional scientist.
At the time, it was thought that chimpanzees and other animals were all very much below the human species, and you gave numbers to scientific study. And so Jane named them, and that was frowned upon by the scientific community. She also thought that chimpanzees had personalities, and that was also not the general contention of the day.
Despite complaints over her methods, what Goodall witnessed during her time with the chimpanzees would shake popular scientific consensus to its foundation.
Near the end of her money running out for the first 6 months, Jane made her really groundbreaking discovery, which was that chimpanzees make and use tools. And this was really the sort of turning point of her career. She's now known as the woman who redefined man.
Goodall also made the first recorded observation of chimpanzees eating meat, recorded a complex social system, and noticed primitive communications between the chimpanzees. Since this first study in the early 1960s, Jane Goodall has returned to study and discover more about the ways that chimpanzees interact. She has also worked tirelessly as an animal rights advocate, campaigning to end the use of animals like chimpanzees as a tool for scientific research or for entertainment.
Jane's work really showed us that chimpanzees have feelings, have emotions, have a high intelligence. They're very, very similar. They're our closest living relative. And I think the implication of that is that we need to respect the world that we live in. We need to respect the other animals. We need to respect the environment we live in.
Jane Goodall describes herself as speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves. Her work forced us to redefine our relationship to the animal world, and since then, she has used her influence to progress the growing animal rights movement.
What the chimps have taught me over these years is that they're so like us. They've blurred the line between human and animal, and just as we can't turn our back on an orphan human child, we can't turn our backs either on these guys.
When the State of Israel was declared in 1948, thousands of Palestinians were displaced, triggering a struggle between Israel and Palestine that would span decades. Celebrated by some, condemned as a terrorist by others, he was a symbol of the fight to restore Palestine. Yasser Arafat's campaign against Israel began in 1959 with the formation of Fatah, a political and military organization that sought the liberation of Palestine.
Leader of the Al-Fatah and unquestionably the most influential man in the whole guerrilla movement is Yasser Arafat.
In 1969, Arafat was appointed as chairman of the executive committee of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO.
Under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the PLO remains the dominant political force among the Palestinians.
In November 1974, Arafat addressed the United Nations General Assembly, the first representative from a non-governmental organization to do so.
He said that I've come to you as both a freedom fighter and a peacemaker. And I think his position was somewhere between the two, because he had the difficulty in really abandoning his gun altogether. But on the other hand, then Israel also made no serious concessions to him in order to help him in that process.
The stated aim of Arafat and the PLO to replace Israel with a new secular Palestinian state makes his organization totally unacceptable to the Israeli government, who steadfastly refused to deal with them.
To the United States and Israel, Arafat and the PLO were terrorists. But some European countries were beginning to open a dialogue with Arafat. Despite this diplomatic progress, the PLO was still involved in armed conflict. In 1987, they led an uprising known as the First Intifada that broke out across Gaza and the West Bank in Palestine. A year later, Arafat declared the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with him as president. Over 25 countries recognized the government in exile. In the early 1990s, Arafat represented Palestine in talks with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
His expectation was that would definitely lead to establishment of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and will enable the Palestinians to have an independent state of their own on the 1967 borders. But he could not really achieve that objective.
Out of these talks, a new Palestinian Authority was established. But the 1996 election of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had opposed the new authority, would see Israel and Palestine at odds once again. Arafat once described peace for Palestine as only achievable through an all-out war that would last for generations. He has yet to be proven wrong. Former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan described Yasser Arafat as a man who expressed and symbolized in his person the national aspirations of the Palestinian people. But his critics saw him as a terrorist whose true objective was personal power and authority. Wherever the man and his motivations truly stood, for decades he succeeded in positioning Palestine on the world agenda as no one had before him.
You see, it all starts with a baby, and the mother says, boo, and scares the hell out of the baby, gives it the hiccups, and then the baby giggles. There's its first moment of fear. We all enjoy, shall we say, putting our toe in the cold water of fear.
Alfred Hitchcock began his film career in Britain in the late 1920s and early 1930s.
He became probably the most successful film director in Britain, and he'd reached the position of being the biggest fish in a rather small pond. And of course the call came for him to go to Hollywood.
Hitchcock would go on to spend decades working in Hollywood, producing some of his most influential and inventive work. Masterpieces of cinema like Rear Window, Vertigo, and North by Northwest. His deep fascination with human psychology and his technical understanding of how to use film language to its greatest effect made him an expert at crafting suspense.
I don't care whether it's English audiences, American, Japanese, they're all the same. They all love to enjoy fear.
They're coming! They're coming!
Hitchcock was capable of using every detail to manipulate his audience.
For the bulk of his Hollywood career, he was the producer as well as the director of his films. And that sort of sense of wanting complete control was very important to him.
This level of precision and control is most apparent in Hitchcock's film Psycho, released in 1960.
The murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound. And
the unusual structure of the story, where the heroine and star actress is killed suddenly, was a shocking twist for the audience.
Hitchcock created a form of filmmaking which I think remains what many filmmakers today really aspire to. The ability to totally shape an audience's experience, to draw them in, to control their emotional identification, especially their identification with the storyline, to shock them and surprise them, to pull the rug out from beneath their feet.
These incredible storytelling skills, combined with the unique and unorthodox way that Psycho was promoted, confirmed Hitchcock's position as truly revolutionary in his field. At the time, cinemagoers would often wander into a film well after it had started. With a film like Psycho, this wouldn't have been possible. Weeks before the film was released, newspaper ads and posters explained that no one would be seated after the credits began. It worked. Audiences flocked to see Psycho. one of the many successes in a career that spanned over 40 years. In that time, Hitchcock made more than 50 films and earned 5 Academy Award nominations.
But Hitchcock wasn't just clever and manipulative. He was deep, he was profound. His films are really telling us something about human motivation, human sensibility, in a way that not many films are.
A masterful lyricist and musician, his work paved the way for music as social commentary and as protest. In June 1965, Bob Dylan recorded a single for his 3rd album, taking his folk music sound in a bold new direction. Part folk, part rock, with poetic but acerbic criticism of flawed social values.
Nothing had ever sounded like Dylan. Nobody had ever sung that way, let alone write songs that addressed the audience that way.
The song was Like a Rolling Stone, a perfect expression of Dylan's inventive counterculture attitude.
Like a Rolling Stone summed up Dylan's career so completely and so precisely in that one song. His writing was so fierce and so pointed, it really reached an audience of people who were asking the same questions. And it's the pinnacle of his career, there's no question.
The song divided fans. Purist folk music fans felt betrayed by his use of electric guitar and the new direction of his lyrics. Longing for the Bob Dylan they already knew, the folk musician who sang acoustic protest songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin', anthems for a time of burgeoning counterculture and social change. Bob Dylan's music captured the mood of a generation. In his career, he wrote over 500 songs, recorded by over 2,000 artists. Among them are some of the most enduring and groundbreaking songs of the century, filled with the lyrical genius that remains an influence on music today.
He was the one that showed all these musicians the power of lyric. His writerly approach to what was essentially vernacular folk music lifted it into a realm of fine art where it had never been before. He etched the American experience in music.
In the late 1970s, personal computers were not big business. Ruled by technology hobbyists who freely shared information and software developments. A culture turned on its head by one man.
It's amazing that the next 20 years hold as much challenge and opportunity as the last 20 did.
Bill Gates and his business partner Paul Allen founded the software company Microsoft in 1975. In the early years, the company struggled to meet their overheads.
You can only buy direct.
Gates later projected that only 10% of people using their software had paid for it, making it almost impossible to keep their business afloat. Until 1980, when Gates landed a game-changing contract to build an operating system for the new personal computer being developed by computing giant IBM.
When they had hired Gates to write the operating system, they let Microsoft keep the license to it. They didn't insist on acquiring the intellectual property. And that made all the difference for IBM, for Gates, and for the industry as a whole. Because what happened was, after IBM made its PC, because Microsoft owned the operating system, it could license that out to any other company that wanted to make a personal computer. And that's how we ended up with Dell and Gateway and all the other competitors who helped bring down the price of PCs to the point where everybody could have one.
Gates' deal to retain the rights to his operating system, known as MS-DOS, helped establish personal computing as a new market.
In order to run any software on a personal computer, you need a mode of communication between that software and your computer. Most PCs come standard with Microsoft's Disk Operating System, or MS-DOS.
By 1983, 30% of the world's computers were running on Microsoft's software. The massive expansion of the company gave Gates a platform for his next great invention, the Windows operating system, released in 1985. Featuring a fully visual interface, it provided consumer-level access to the extensive functionality of a computer.
Without the operating system that it devised, and then the programs, the utilities, the spreadsheets, the word processing programs, all the things that made a computer work and useful, Microsoft helped develop.
Gates believed that properly monetizing the development of computing was the only way to ensure innovation. He created a system that still dominates computing worldwide, but his control over that system also made it possible for other computer companies to compete with IBM.
I think Gates's greatest achievement was his role in democratizing computing. In the 1950s, when the first kind of computers were built, the CEO of IBM famously said, "We'll only need about 40 or 50 of these in the world." And the thing that happened in the last few decades of the 20th century was that literally almost everyone in the world got a computer.
Bill Gates entered one century having personally made a significant impact on the role of personal computing in society. While doing so, he also built a massive personal fortune. He began the new century with a pledge to give 95% of his personal wealth to charity. A new purpose that may someday prove to be his enduring legacy. The Queen of Hearts, the People's Princess. She was given many labels, but behind the headlines was the real woman, compassionate and flawed, completely human. On the night of August 31st, 1997, photographers chased a car carrying Diana, Princess of Wales, at high speed through the streets of Paris. The attention of the paparazzi was common for Diana. This time it would end in tragedy when her driver lost control of the car, killing Diana, her partner Dodi Fayed, and himself. When the news of her death emerged, an unprecedented public outpouring of grief was seen in London and around the globe.
It was astonishing. People who'd been completely uninterested in the royal family went to Kensington Palace and laid flowers. People were very emotional about it in a way that the British are not normally. It was almost like being in a different country than it normally was.
Diana's story had seemed at first to be a real-life fairy tale. In 1981, she became instantly famous when she was announced as the future bride of the Prince of Wales. Their marriage in 1982 was televised worldwide. But the fairy tale soon started to crumble. Their relationship and divorce became fodder for tabloid journalism. Diana would later admit that she found it increasingly difficult to survive the spotlight. She may have grown to hate the constant media presence in her life, but Diana turned that attention into an incredible force for good.
Later, a disabled volleyball match came to an abrupt halt when the players spotted their royal visitor. There was no hiding her good spirits. Perhaps it's because she's been able to spread real hope here.
The most prominent cause Diana took on after her divorce was her involvement with the British Red Cross and their campaign to eradicate landmines.
I was Africa correspondent for my newspaper, the Sunday Times, when she went to Angola on what turned out to be the last trip before she died. And I was told to go and cover her visit. And actually I was really angry because I thought, I'm not a royal correspondent. I cover wars and conflicts and disasters and this is going to be kind of silly. But Angola was still at war at that time, really brutal civil war. And I have to say, my impression of her completely changed because it was a difficult trip.
I'm only trying to highlight a problem that's going on all around the world. That's all.
Iconic images of Diana walking through a landmine clearing zone in Angola, wearing protective headgear and vest, with trousers and simple shoes, filled newspapers and magazines.
We went to hospitals where nobody had ever heard of Princess Diana. It was really one of the few places on Earth where people didn't know who she was. I have never seen anybody that was able to show such empathy towards children and people in hospital as she did. And there was a little girl who horribly injured from a mine, and the little girl said to me afterwards, "Who was that?" And I said, "It was a princess." And she said, "I thought it was an angel."
Diana came to the world's attention as the fairy tale princess. But her true story and her lasting legacy was her ability to turn the source of her own pain into a means of bringing a light to the terrible suffering of others. A legacy that she was only just starting to build when her life was cut tragically short. In Guatemala, one woman would represent the struggle of her people, calling attention to a failure of human rights that was happening around the globe. For Rigoberta Menchú, the fight for indigenous rights and for the victims of government oppression was a deeply personal battle. An indigenous Mayan woman of Guatemala, Menchú experienced firsthand the kind of intolerance and oppression she was fighting to end. As a child, she worked on plantations with her family, picking cotton and coffee. A common experience for the hundreds of thousands of Mayan people of Guatemala. On the plantations, 2 of her brothers died. By the time she was 21, her mother, father, and another brother had all been brutally murdered. Victims of the struggle between guerrilla forces and the country's oppressive military dictatorship.
The Guatemalan authorities used many methods of oppression against their perceived enemies. It was often, if not mostly, the poorer, indigenous people who suffered.
Menchú was also politically active, fighting for women's rights, indigenous rights, and against her government. By 1981, she would be forced into exile in Mexico, but she continued to fight. Her struggle began to gain global attention when she revealed the plight of indigenous people in her country through her widely translated book, I, Rigoberta Menchú, in 1983. Menchú used this new platform to advocate for the rights of indigenous people of the Americas, campaigning worldwide for cultural reconciliation between indigenous people and European settlers. In 1992, she became the first indigenous person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. 2 years later, the United Nations declared an international decade for indigenous peoples, and Rigoberta Menchú was appointed as a UN ambassador for indigenous rights worldwide. Since then, she has never stopped fighting to represent those who don't have a voice.
Es el momento de hacer un termómetro de qué tanto Guatemala vive con sus propios espantos y que le hace producir el racismo, la discriminación y la exclusión.
Rigoberta Menchú turned a life of terrible hardship and tragedy into a global role as advocate for the powerless and dispossessed. She was one of many indigenous voices calling for change. Neither the first or last to fight for indigenous rights. What Menchú achieved was to turn the world's attention to the ongoing impact of European settlement on the lives of indigenous populations around the world, to the global issue of dispossession and inequality. He was a revolutionary who became a fixture of global politics for decades, a figurehead for one of the most important moments of the Cold War. Fidel Castro began his political life as a revolutionary in the 1950s, fighting to free Cuba from the grips of Batista's military dictatorship. Based in the Sierra Maestra in southeast Cuba, Castro led 800 fighters in one of the most successful guerrilla warfare campaigns in history.
This was the scene of turmoil in the capital, Havana, as the climax of revolution was reached. Anyone suspected of sympathy for the Batista regime came in for a rough time.
On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country, defeated.
The level of support for Fidel Castro in Cuba when they came to Havana in 1959 was unbelievable, unbelievable. The unfortunate part is that rather than turn this into a moment of uniting the population, the high level of political repression that would happen in Cuba began as well. This wasn't very much noticed by the international press because everybody fell in love with the Cuban Revolution and Castro.
A tumultuous welcome for Fidel Castro. It's one of New York's most enthusiastic receptions for a visiting notable in quite a while.
That love only lasted until Castro began nationalizing companies and industries, returning foreign-owned land to the state.
He achieved virtually the impossible. He established a communist satellite right on the doorstep of the United States.
The United States, wary of the threat of communism, broke off diplomatic relations in 1961. By April, a group of Cuban exiles armed by the US government landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, there to overthrow Castro. Instead, they were quickly crushed by Castro's forces. The incident was a huge embarrassment for America, a blow to President Kennedy's administration, and an awakening for Castro.
The Bay of Pigs marks a very important moment when he realizes just the rhetoric alone isn't going to get me anywhere. I need to do something to protect Cuba and the revolution in the long term.
Castro turned to the Soviet Union for military and economic support. In October 1962, an American reconnaissance plane flying over Cuba discovered the preparation of Soviet nuclear weapon launch sites on the island. The threat of nuclear war was on America's doorstep.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
For 13 days, the world was closer to global disaster than at any other stage in the Cold War. With Fidel Castro and Cuba at the center of a standoff between Kennedy and Soviet President Khrushchev. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended diplomatically, and Castro was personally able to survive the fallout. But his would be the last successful revolution in Latin America. The global climate meant that such instability and uncertainty would not be tolerated.
Had there been no Cold War, perhaps that kind of support might have led to that ultimate independence of the region that we all dream about. Unfortunately, there was a Cold War, and it awoke a level of concern on the part of the Americans that they could not allow another Cuba in South America. And therefore comes the wave of state terrorism in Latin America of the 70s and 80s, in Brazil, in Argentina, Chile, which really installed a reign of terror that had never ever been seen in Latin America since the Spanish conquistadores. And that is something that is the negative impact of Castro's support for those revolutionary movements, and the region had to pay very dearly for it.